Welcome to the webinar tonight. As discussed, as advertised, I'm going to talk about how to develop and demonstrate your professional writing skills for the professional synoptic assessment. Some of the tips will probably be applicable to any written task in your professional exams. But I've tried a little bit more towards the synoptic assessment that's probably quite imminent for you guys. And as I said already, if there are any questions that you have as I go through, then feel free to contribute in the chat and come in on the mic. It's up to you, really. I'm happy to answer anything that you aren't sure of. So, following the professional writing skills session, which will be relatively short, probably 10-15 minutes, I will be going through a level 4 synoptic style task on management accounting budgeting. And I'll set you up for the task. I'll try to put into place some of the tips I give in this first section and show you how I would construct an answer. So in terms of the professional writing skills, obviously you've got my details there. I'll put all of those up at the end of the session as well. I've looked at the examiner's report of your professional synoptic assessment, and I've looked at, where students tend to have gone wrong or tend to kind of lose marks as they go through these written tasks. Having taught this really since it came in AAT 2016 syllabus, I would say that this task, alongside the tasks that are around management accounting, decision and control, they tend to be the weakest. Part of that is the technical material, but I think a lot of it is down to the techniques in terms of producing an answer. Now, what you'll find with the kinds of tasks that management accounting budgeting sits around is that there is nearly always more than one thing to do. And so what I've done is I've picked out a sample question from some material, and you can see there that although it's a 9-mark question, and we'll talk about splitting out in a second, there are 3 things to do with that requirement. Okay, so as you obviously haven't got the material or the numbers in front of you, but your first job there is to evaluate the layout of the budget. Off the back of that, identify the impact of each issue. So there's a problem with the layout in this way. This could mean identify the impact, and then recommend a suitable improvement. So include a suitable recommendation for improvement off the back of the issue that you've identified. Now, it's quite common for people to go into that style of question and probably read the first sentence and then jump straight into their written answer. Okay, so obviously the first bit is to evaluate the layout. What might also happen is they might scan through and go, all right, well, I've got there to come up with recommendations for improvement. It's quite common, as I mentioned, that really one part of that will be missed. So it's essential that when you get into this assessment, you sit back, it's time pressured, but you sit back and go, right, how many elements are there to this requirement? And let me think about how I'm going to construct my answer. Now, what's also worth recommending, or rather what's also recommended, is that you look at the marks on offer. So if there's 3 things to do and there are 9 marks available, ultimately you're going to have to follow that pattern 3 times. Yeah, layout, identifying the impact, and coming up with a suitable recommendation. There's your formula. If you do that 3 times, based on some of the recommendations and advice I'm going to give, you stand a good chance of passing the particular task. So let me show you how I would present an answer to this. I think it's quite important when you produce an answer in the assessment for this style of task to try and make it abundantly clear to the marker that you're trying to answer all of the question. You can see what I've done there is I've spaced my answer out, and what I'm doing is I'm actively trying to say to the marker, look, this is where I think I should score. the 3 marks. So that first paragraph is evaluating the layout. In this particular task, they hadn't flexed the budget. So obviously this is material that you've covered already with budgeting. But ultimately you're aware of the fact that a budget retrospectively should be flexed to actual performance to give you some meaningful information. Now, I identify that as a problem. So part of the evaluation of the layout is to say, I don't like this layout because the budget's not being flexed. As I've said, the budget's based upon sales of 500 units, company sold 600. There's a problem. So I've identified the issue. What I'm then going to do, second part of the question, is talk about what that might do. So identify the impact. If I don't have a budget flexed, if I have a budget that isn't flexed, then the variances that are calculated off the back of that budget aren't going to mean anything. Yeah, it's very likely if you sold 600 units and your budget's written on 500, that you're likely to have a lot of favourable variances in this instance because you sold more units. And we know that what you're effectively doing there is you're comparing chalk with cheese. You need to bring the budget in line through that flexing process. And as a result, at the moment, the variances just don't mean anything. The impact of that is that staff might make inappropriate decisions. There are lots of things you can say with these written style tasks, but as long as your answer is sensible, relevant, uses the evidence in the scenario, then it's likely to attract marks. And then the third step, I'd recommend that the budget is flexed to actual performance to improve its accuracy and usefulness to the department. So I come up with a recommendation for improvement, which might seem relatively simple. Budget isn't flexed, could lead to poor decision making. I would flex the budget, but you can see my answer doesn't look like that. It's taken that methodical approach. I've tried to word it professionally, which is something I'll come to later. And as I said, I'm trying to spread my answer out so that the examiner is able to go, yep, this candidate has addressed the 3 steps within that requirement. And as I said, for 9 marks, I've tried to apply a bit of logic and maybe get 3 of those. When I've marked this, so when I've taught this in class and I've taken answers into mark, it's really common that answers are squished and sometimes it's not discernible, if you like, as kind of where they've tried to, or what part of the requirement they've tried to address. So just make sure, and it's a simple thing, isn't it? Just make sure that your answer is spaced out, that you're not sticking all of your points into one sentence, and that effectively you're making it as easy to mark for the markers as possible. Okay. The other thing that's worth pointing out, and again, something that historically causes issues, is that the AAT with the Professional Synoptic, they write their requirements and tasks around different verbs. So you saw that one there. If I come back and ask you to evaluate the layout. An evaluation, as you can see, is basically pick up arguments for and against. So pros and cons, advantages, disadvantages in certain cases. What can happen, as I said, is if you don't think about what evaluation means, you could provide perhaps, an answer that lacks balance. Later on, I'm going to show you the advantages and disadvantages of a rolling budget, because that came up in one of the tasks. If you produce an answer that just looks at the advantages, then you're not providing a full evaluation, all right? So you need to think about both sides of the argument, if you like. One of the other things they ask you to do in certain cases is discuss, all right? And that could mean pros and cons again. What they might also give you in a task here are the pros and cons, and your job, as you can see at the bottom there, is to compare and contrast particular methods. So they might give you, one method of producing a budget versus another, some evidence, and you've got to talk about maybe which one would be a more appropriate method. You'll also see when you look through some of these sample assessments that you, in certain cases, to assess. Yeah. And generally, when they ask you to assess something here, you're looking often at the strengths and weaknesses of something. Yeah. So we've had in the past a requirement that's asked you to assess the strategic position of a business through the method of a SWOT analysis. And so you're judging, as it says up here, quality, ability, importance of particular factors to come to an overall conclusion on strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. And then another common one that you saw actually in the other part of that requirement that I showed you is to recommend. So advise the appropriate actions to pursue. Now, so you're giving overall advice. Mine was effectively to flex the budget so that the budget has more meaning. Okay. So as I said, it's worth considering those. There are more. I've picked the ones that are the most common. Just pay attention in the assessment to the verb that they give you as part of the requirement, because it might mean, or it might give a bit of a clue as to where your answer is going to go. Okay. And then the other big tip that I have when you produce written answers here is to think about the context. Okay. It's really quite common, in fact, in most cases, vast majority of cases, that you're producing an answer, written answers to the chief accountant. So, your case is built around Horizon hot tubs, isn't it? And you'll be talking to the chief exec or the chief accountant in certain cases, even when we move into to 2023. What you therefore can't do is write an answer informally. Okay, the advice I always give is think about the language you would use if you were addressing, maybe a manager at work or a client, perhaps. You've got to avoid jargon. The AAT are quite harsh on anything that isn't professionally worded, if you like. So I'll give an example here. So the impact of not flexing a budget, staff can't tell properly whether the variances are good or not. That isn't worded in a professional manner. Whereas the bottom one, variances are meaningless, as I mentioned, this may lead to staff making inappropriate decisions as the information is accurate. And again, when I mark these, quite a lot of the time would I get answers worded similarly to that one there in red. So it's just quite important that when you're putting an answer together for this in the assessment, you're considering the nature of the language you're using, because they will be looking for that kind of thing. There are a couple of, there's a sample assessment on the AAT website that might have been used if you attended one of our courses. But one of the really useful parts of that is that there's a marking scheme at the back, and you'll see that a lot of the time they will kind of class your answer. So rather than maybe, although we use it as a guide, awarding a point per relevant mark in every written task, they might classify or grade your answer. So, 8 to 10 would include things like it's professionally worded, well reasoned, etc. And then a slightly less or a lower quality answer might not necessarily attract many marks. So making sure you word things appropriately will score you credit. All right. Yeah, so they're just some of my tips, because those types of things are often taken for granted. And so it's just worth considering when you go into the assessment that you're breaking the requirement down, you're thinking about the verbs that they're asking you to, or that the tasks are based around, and that you are considering the context of your answer. Okay, this is your final assessment. You're expected to be able to demonstrate that you can communicate your ideas in a professional manner. They want you as an AAT member to be able to demonstrate professional skills, which is a lot of what this this assessment's about. Okay. Does anyone have any questions at all on technique, constructing professional answers, anything like that? No? Okay, cool. Well, as I said, I'm going to move on to the technical element of the session now, but if you do have any questions in the run-up to the assessment, then there's my email address. Feel free to contact me. I'm happy to help with anything. So we're going to move on to a bit of revision, really. It will go through some technical content, but I think a lot of what this is useful for, hopefully, is me putting into practice some of the things I've recommended there. So I've picked, as you can see, a budgeting style task. I will just open up a Word document. I'm going to put my answer into Microsoft Word. I could probably do it actually in the document that the scenario comes in itself. All right, so you're probably aware, if you've been studying this assessment, that a lot of your management accounting budgeting content is assessed in task 2 in the assessment. So you can see here that I've picked this one. It's from one of First Intuition's mock assessments. You've got a scenario where, again, they've given you a budget and you've got to produce a series of written answers based upon it, which again, I'm going to talk you through. So what I would do if I were faced with this in the assessment is I would very quickly scan through what you've got. I mean, I wouldn't read it, to be honest with you, in full until I've actually had a look at what it is I've got to do. So you've got what is effectively a budget, then some background information. You've got some more information on what looked like some kind of bonus scheme. And there are then 3 parts to this overall task. So task 2 in the assessment will be worth 15 marks. So, that will always be the case. And so you can see that split 3 ways, 5 marks a piece. So the 3 areas that they're asking us to look at, as you can see, are to explain the variance report and how this could be improved to provide more relevant and detailed information. We're then asked to evaluate the move to a rolling budget and the benefits it will provide to the business. Okay, so just got to be careful with that one, because they're asking us to evaluate, but then also cite the benefits. To be honest, citing the benefits would come through some evaluation, but we'll get to that. And then part C, explain the motivation impact of the current budget approach and the proposed budget approach on the sales managers. So effectively what happens up here is they've got a current approach which might not necessarily be working as well as it could be, so they're considering replacing it. So I'll talk you through each of these. I'll show you how I might produce an answer for this. So just having a look at what you've got then. You're told Holly, and you're provided that background information on who Holly is from your pre-release material. You've been considering an opportunity to acquire a division of a business which manufactures pumps. They're used for their hot tubs, and they also have a much wider market as they can be used for home pools. They've provided you with a variance report, as you can see there. And Christopher and Malik are reviewing this ahead of the directors' meeting. Christopher's emailed you because he's confused by the variances. He needs to give a presentation on these results to the board, and was expecting to discuss a fairly poor position for the business, but it looks like a fair amount of the variances are favourable. Okay. You can probably see why based on what I talked about earlier, but we'll get there. His email mentions the lower than expected sales volume. He's aware of a 6-month delay launching a new upgrade. And then there's some poor consumer spending as well. So the pool pumps blames poor sales upon those two factors. Neither of these would be predicted at the beginning of the year, so they're not taken into account with this budget. So you're given that, and to be honest with you, you would be able, I suppose, from there to answer A and B, but I'll just go through this all before I start to produce an answer. You're then told they produce annual fixed budgets and they're compiled in a central spreadsheet. Company's got a December year end. Sales manager has a salary of 30,000, and then there's an individual bonus based on sales targets. More specifically, there are two levels of bonus. So there's a lower level, and the lower level is that when managers generate 800 or help to generate £800,000 worth of revenue, they get a bonus equating to 20% of salary. If they then secure a further 800,000 in sales, bonus increases just by 5%. Okay, so the upper target is 25%. The manager hasn't achieved the upper target, and they're thinking about changing it. So they're thinking about replacing this with a monthly rolling budget. And the bonuses based upon that would be related to targets set on monthly performance rather than annual performance. So you'd be appraising a manager on what they do monthly. For example, they could set a target of £50,000 in sales revenue, and the reward would be 1% of salary. And then in the next month, they'd look at the economy, they'd look at any external factors, and there would maybe be a different target revenue. So they would basically keep adapting, as a rolling budget does, the targets based upon any external factors. And our requirement here was to prepare a report to Christopher, Sales Director, Horizon Hot Tubs, to cover the following three sections. So the first thing we're asked to do then is explain the variance report and how this could be improved to provide more relevant and detailed information. Again, don't just jump in, think about exactly what you're being asked to do here. And as I mentioned, there's nearly always more than one thing to do. So they're asking us to explain the variance report and also how this could be improved. Okay. What you therefore want to do is make sure that your marks are split, or rather your answers split, to address and try to score as many of those as possible. You're not going to know in the assessment, exactly how many marks each part's worth, but there will be flexibility. There are often more kind of marks available than the total. So in essence, there might be, say, 6 ways to score the 5 marks. I would just consider splitting your answer appropriately. If you've got time, you could maybe come up with 3 for this and 3 for this. If you don't, and you just want to make sure you're sticking to the time of trying to get an answer down within that time, you might do, say, 2 points on the variance issue and then 3 on improvements. Now, the point is that you want to make sure your answer addresses both parts. So let me give you a bit of advice on how I would do this. You can see it's set up as a report. Now, this stuff here, I've looked at the AAT samples, and it doesn't look like you have to complete these. I suppose just in the off chance you would have to, well, you would just make sure that you're putting the right information in. So the reports to Christopher. And the subject would be, I don't know, what they asked us. Anything sensible. Budgeting and say the bonus scheme. You need to remember who you are, and they tell you that in the assessment itself, or rather who Christopher is, Christopher Ward. Not that I don't think, as I said, I don't think they're going to be this specific. And then the date. I don't. You wouldn't have to bother with this, but let's just go for that. All right. So as I said, the first thing I'm going to have to do is talk about the variance report. In the assessment, this will be just one box, so you wouldn't be as flexible as this. You'd produce an answer 4 or 5 marks within kind of a box that sits underneath this. Obviously, what I'll do is imagine that that's the case and put an answer in there. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to explain the variance report. Okay, and you've got to imagine, as you are asked to, that you're talking or preparing a report to Christopher. Christopher works in sales. He might not therefore know what a variance report is. And so, although we almost take it as read because we've studied this stuff, we need to state the basics. Okay. So I would put something like the variance report is a comparison of the expected activity. I suppose what you could do is put it in the context of the question. So they expected to sell 186,000 units, and they did sell 125,800. Okay. Look at the brackets there. Formatting's out, but we will. Okay. So you got that. All right. Now that there is part of my explanation. What a variance report does, basically, you can see here, is it compares budget and actual. The variances are off. We probably know why, but we'll come to that. Christopher can't quite believe that so many of them are favourable. So we want to, first of all, I suppose, explain what variances are. Okay, so for each element, a variance is identified. Having done budget versus actual as explained above, these are a comparison between the budgeted figure and the actual figure. As I said, it might seem fairly obvious that your variance report does that, but you have to remember that you're talking to somebody, or you're responding to somebody here that doesn't work in accounting, doesn't work in finance. I'd probably finish up there by just saying, when a variance shows performance is better than expected, favourable, well, favourable variance occurs. When performance is worse than expected, variance will be stated as adverse as maybe as seen in the report. Okay. So what I've done there, probably for 3 marks, so maybe I'm overshooting it, but if I've got time, I'm going to play it safe. And I've tried to do the first part of that requirement. What I've then got to do, and personally I would find this bit easier in the assessment, you might not agree, but I'm now going to talk about how it could be improved. So can anybody there see any issues? I'll just come back. You might have. Did you see this there? so from what we've got there, there's hopefully a fairly obvious issue. Yeah, absolutely, Amelia. It hasn't been flexed. A bit like the one I was using as an example earlier, the budget hasn't been flexed. Now read the question carefully. You're just asked, rather than to state the issue, so that might come into your answer to facilitate a recommendation. You're just asked to come up with, as you can see here, ideas on how it could be improved. I'd make it as clear to the assessor, the marker, as possible. So I would say something like, budget could be improved through, and then I'd come up with a couple of ideas. All right. So I would say, based on what you've said there, using a flexed budget. The budget, just to explain that a bit, the budget would be restated to the actual level of activity. Which was 125,800 units. So a like-for-like comparison can be made. Okay. So there's one of them, absolutely. What else? So I'll give you a bit of a clue. Coming back up here, you're just told that you've got a material variance, a labour variance, a production overhead variance, etc. At this level, so at level 4, when you did management accounting budgeting, what did you do when you calculated materials variances? Anyone think of what you did? Okay, yeah, not a bad idea there, Caroline. You could come up with a cost per unit, which would give you an idea of, well, exactly how much you were spending on a per unit basis, which might be more indicative of overall performance. When we did budgeting and we calculated variances, we went into more detail, didn't we? With material, for instance. So what did we do when we calculated the materials variances? Or rather, what calculations did we make, as an example? Anyone think? So let me give you an example. I am making tables in a factory, and at the end of the year, I've got an adverse variance. Why might that have happened? Yeah, absolutely. So I might have spent more on the wood than I expected to. Why else? Yep, absolutely. You used more. So when we did budgeting, hopefully this is the pennies dropping now, and decision and control, what we did is we identified that when a materials variance occurs, it could be as a result of price or usage. And we had that detail when we undertook variance analysis back in that particular unit. So another criticism that I might be able to level at this is simply that it lacks detail. Yeah. So how could the budget be improved? Maybe through more detailed variance information. Okay. For example, a material variance. Yeah, so that's what this unit, that's what a decision control sought to do, elaborate or get more information on why particular variances have occurred. Another reason, if I look up here and I'll ask a couple of leading questions, is do we have any information as to why marketing and distribution is adverse, so significantly adverse as well? Is there anything in there that tells us that? I mean, we could guess, absolutely, as you've said there. Haven't really got anything direct, haven't we? We haven't got anything specific to that. And basically, when I've got variance report, although it's not going to be demonstrated actually on the report, I've got no real kind of supporting information, and therefore stuff like this I just can't really use because I don't know what it consists of and therefore why it's occurred. And as a result, I would just say the budget could be improved through other supporting information. For example, marketing expenses are a lot higher than expected. It'd be useful to know types of costs are categorized as marketing costs. I mean, obviously, you'd say marketing costs, but specifically what sits in there. So, I mean, they are just three reasons, or rather, sorry, three recommended improvements. You could definitely come up with more. Caroline, you recommended the cost per unit approach. Related to that, if I can elaborate on that slightly, if I were to flex this budget, so basically you'd take the budget and you would flex it down, of course, to 125,800. Is it clear there how I'm going to do that? For example, yeah, no, absolutely. And why not? Exactly. Yeah, a couple of you said a similar thing. You don't know which costs are fixed and which are variable. So you've got no supporting information on things like cost behavior either. And that's another criticism. I'd recommend you flex the budget. Yeah, fine, but how? So you could say that the information could be improved by giving some information on behavior. Yeah, that kind of thing. As I said, there is no, although obviously some points are right, there's no one way to produce a written answer. So as long as you've got the evidence and your answer is sensible and commercially sound, if you like, then you're likely to score marks. So don't worry about thinking, well, is this information relevant or am I talking too simplistically? You can see there that my answer is, whilst technical, isn't, it's not overly involved or anything like that. And hopefully that is a bit reassuring to you that actually you haven't got to go over and above here. It's not too involved to score the marks that you need to score. Any questions at all on the first bit? Okay, the next bit then was to evaluate the use of a rolling budget. Right, this one as well was for 5 marks. And as I said, the key word here is evaluate the move to a rolling budget, because that, as I discussed on the previous slides, or that rather, would mean that you have to identify some pros and cons. There's some, I suppose, risks and benefits, advantages and disadvantages. Therefore, the benefits should drop out. The benefits that it provides, will provide to the business, will hopefully come out when I do my evaluation. So I'm going to just start by reminding you what a rolling budget is, and then I'm going to ask you for some ideas as to why it's a good or a bad thing. So I wouldn't overdo this. I can't categorically say it's going to score credit, but even if it doesn't, it helps you to get into the answer itself. So I would say something along the lines of, basically I'm going to define it. A rolling budget, it's a budget that's regularly reviewed to reflect any changes to conditions that may affect horizon. So basically you update the budget we tend to accept on a monthly basis. The other element to it is the budget is rolled forward, hence the term rolling, so as to looks not formal enough. I was talking about that earlier. So as to ensure that it covers the next 12 months. Okay. All right, so that is a very brief reminder of what a rolling budget is. Can anybody, so what I'm going to do basically is I'm going to try and come up with a couple of pros and a couple of cons so that my evaluation. Can anybody tell me, has anybody got any ideas as to why it might be a good thing? Start with a good thing, benefits. Why would a rolling budget work here? Try not to focus too much on the bonuses because that's the next bit. But we discussed, and you had to study / will need to remember the pros and cons of each type of budget for this assessment. Can anybody remember why a rolling budget might be a good thing? Yeah, absolutely. So it keeps accurate costs of things like materials and labour. If I not elaborate on that, but make that even more generic, I suppose. Basically, they're more accurate, as you've said there. As budgets are updated, as rolling budgets are updated on let's go for a monthly basis, they're more accurate as they reflect current, let's go for market conditions. So you're absolutely right there, Caroline. As an example, at the moment we're seeing increased cost of living. So with the cost of living crisis, things like materials are likely to be going up, so the costs are likely to be increasing. If I wrote the budget, say it's November, if I wrote the budget back in January, the material costs are clearly going to be out of date. So by having a rolling budget, your materials costs will be more accurate by virtue of them being more up to date. Okay. I suppose off the back of that, what you could then say would be, by virtue of being more accurate and up to date, rolling budgets tend often lead to more accurate decision making, or to more, I've used the term word accurate already, more, well, better management decision making. Okay. Factors are closely monitored to ensure they are reflected in the budget. So my two there are, based on what Caroline has said, they're more accurate because they're more up to date, and what that tends to mean is that they will lead to better decisions. Okay, so Horizon would benefit for those reasons. What I probably should have done is made it abundantly clear to the marker that I'm providing the benefits here. So one thing I didn't mention directly actually is that you can use, and I'd recommend you use, even if they're not necessarily, or even if some of them are given here, headings. So something like that. Yeah. What I want to do with an evaluation, as I've mentioned already, is come up with some issues. Okay. So there might be certain problems associated with rolling budgets. Can anybody remember, right back in the archives of your mind, I'm sure, with your memory, can anybody remember why rolling budgets might create problems? Oh, if you mean basically it can take a lot of time. Absolutely, yeah. So as a couple of you have said there, it takes ages because what you're effectively doing is you're rewriting or recalculating the budgets every month. Yeah. So rolling budgets are time consuming as they require regular updates. This may lead to increased costs. So basically, because they're time consuming, they're likely to be expensive. Okay. And another one, anyone think of anything else? I'm going to give you a big clue here. How might staff feel if you keep changing the goalposts? So what? Yeah, absolutely. It might have a negative impact on demotivation. You know, imagine the standard cost of producing a table in terms of materials, let's say, is £5. In January, it's £5. In February, it's £6. In March, it's back down to £5. In April, it's £7. I'm going to stop caring because it's going to be very difficult to keep up. So one of the kind of big problems with rolling budgets is the targets, the standards keep changing because you're constantly updating. So as the standards change continuously, staff lose focus upon their budgetary targets. And as you said there, Amelia, this can have a negative impact upon motivation. Yeah. So again, if you've got time, you might want to create a bit of a safety net by coming up with one or two more. Those pros and cons can be examined, or rather can be assessed. You've got those in your material, so it wouldn't be a bad idea to go back over those. But that there for me is an answer which should score towards the top end marks. All right. And then finally, we were asked to explain the motivation impact of the current budget approach. So again, there are two things to do here. Don't miss this when you take this assessment. You want to do that, but you then also want to talk about the proposed approach. So what's the situation now? How does the current budget impact motivation, and what would be the new situation? Okay. So what I would do here, again, is just make sure my answer is split. So probably what I'd do, just to make sure I do split it, is I'd say, right, there's a heading here for the current approach. And under here, I'm going to talk about some of the issues. So if we look at the evidence again, you've got a December year end, and there are 2 levels of bonus. So they get a salary, but then a bonus based on sales. And there's a lower level, and last year, 800 grand's worth of revenue generated a 20% bonus. Then what you had to do was generate another 800 grand just to get a 5% bonus. So what kind of issues might this create, do you think? Yeah, absolutely. It appears to be relatively easy to achieve the lower level. I mean, I suppose you can see that here. Even with a lower level of sales, a much lower level of sales, the 800 grand has been hit. Okay, so I would start off by saying, trying to drag my points out as much as possible. Something along the lines of issue with the current approach. Is that it appears relatively easy to achieve the lower target, which is fine. It does mean that they're going to try and, well, it's not completely flawed. It does mean that they're going to try and achieve 800 grand's worth of sales. And probably I'd say, therefore, that this is reflected in the operating statement. Basically, it looks like they've achieved 800 grand and more. However, you could argue that to double revenue just for an extra 5% probably isn't going to motivate staff. So in a nutshell, we think that the lower target is quite easy, but the higher target is probably quite difficult. Yeah. So motivation for the lower level, fine. However, there is little motivation to achieve the higher target. As this only increases the bonus by 5%. Okay. I would say as well, maybe that this is supported by the fact that it says they don't achieve it. So, you know, it's not concrete evidence that it's not working, but the fact that the manager hasn't achieved it, there might be other reasons why, but, you know, it kind of suggests that actually kind of not achieving it isn't necessarily a big issue. So this is supported by the fact that the manager has not achieved the higher target. Okay. There's a massive issue with that then. And what do we think that might be? What do we reckon? Yeah, I mean, it's a fairly obvious, hopefully a fairly obvious issue, in that staff are therefore unlikely to try to drive further sales, further revenue, if you like. Sales is probably better. When revenue figure reaches 800,000. So, I mean, there's clearly an issue. okay, in that it can affect motivation. It certainly does when you get to £800,000 worth of revenue. So what about the new approach? So I would then have another heading just to make it abundantly clear to that marker that, look, I'm also doing what you asked me in the second part of the requirement, which is to assess the proposed approach. Okay. Well, actually, to explain the motivation impact, not assess, but explain the impact. So if we then look at what happens here, they're suggesting then on the monthly rolling budget, which we discussed, and then what would happen is they would set targets based on monthly performance rather than annual performance. For example, the manager could be given a target of securing 50 grand in revenue for the first month and a reward of 1% of salary. Then, depending on what's happening both within the business and in the economy, different revenue targets. And to be honest, in effect, all this is the bonus scheme reaping the rewards of the kind of advantages that rolling budgets generate. Okay, so I mean, in the context of the bonuses, I would say the proposed approach or the proposed move to the bonus being based on rolling budgets would be more likely to encourage the manager to, I'll deal with that in a minute, Caroline. I think that looks like a good point, but I'll come to that in a second. Proposing to the bonus being based on rolling budgets would be more likely to encourage a manager to remain motivated on a monthly basis. What I also like about it is that there's the license for Horizon to tweak the target. So as it says, depending on what's happening both within the business and in the economy, at the end of the first month, a different target sales revenue could be set. So in a nutshell, the 50 grand could become maybe unachievable or too easy. And what you would do is you'd restructure it or set a new target. So the new system, as it says, would also be adjusted based upon market conditions, which would provide more realistic targets. Okay, something along those lines. And you can see then overall, again, there's flexibility, but I've tried to make, for the 5 marks, I didn't mind you up here, I've tried to make 5 separate points. Again, if you've got time in the assessment, you can certainly add to that. But realistically, having done mock assessments, you might be aware of this, can be quite time pressured. You don't want to overrun too much, of course, at the expense of all your other tasks, but I would say that kind of answer addresses most of the points, most of the content required in the task itself. Right. Okay, so I think what you're getting at there is it's very expensive in a nutshell, because they're paying bonuses on a high bonus on such a low target, and then a much lower relative bonus, that's 5% on a higher target. Yeah, absolutely. So you could argue that from the company's point of view, the process itself is expensive. Yeah, just be careful. I mean, it's not and it's relevant, it's not incorrect, but just be careful that this is asking more about the impact on staff motivation. If they were talking about pros and cons for the company, then absolutely that's an issue with the bonus scheme. Okay. Any other questions at all? No problem. Any other questions at all? Right, so hopefully that's helped shed some light on how I would approach a written task. How long would you spend on this sort of answer? A good question. If I were doing this in the assessment, as a standard, I would look at the total amount of time I've got. So you have 3 hours, which is 180 minutes. You get there in the end, 180 minutes. You've got 3 hours to complete 100 marks worth of content. So if it's 180 minutes across 100 marks, it's 1.8 minutes a mark. I know that's quite specific, but in a nutshell, a 15 marker, you want to aim for 27 minutes. Okay, you've got some 20 markers in the assessment as well, which I think are tasks 1 and 5. They should be, or you should be aiming there at 36 minutes. So I would be strict with your timing to start with, in that I would just give yourself the amount of equivalent time across the assessment. What you're probably going to find, or what you probably found, is that task 1, which is kind of generally multiple choice stuff, is structured, and task 5, which are your ratios, they tend to take less than 36 minutes. So you've probably got more time on these written answers, but I would come back and add to them once I've answered the other things. So in short, 27 minutes, but then use any extra time at the end to pad out your written answer would be my technique. Okay. What that means is you, in theory, you access all 100 marks before you run out of time. That makes sense? No worries. Any other questions at all? All right, well, as I said, I hope that's been useful. You do remember, have my contact details if you want to get in touch. I'm happy to help in the run-up to the assessment itself. So, well, thank you very much for your time, and keep in touch. Email me if you want to. Thanks very much, guys.